right. This is one of our Olmsted County Human Rights Commission meetings, and we're doing it in what's called a community forum style. We are going to have Chief Peterson, Chief of Police, will be giving a brief presentation between 20 and 25 minutes.
No, it's 30 minutes.
That's 30 minutes? Okay, well, and we're going to hold them to 30 minutes. And at that time, we're going to open it up. We're going to have our panelists come up, and I will introduce them at that time. And we're going to have a community discussion. So there'll be an opportunity to ask questions and to get answers. And hopefully this presentation will make us think and make us see the possibilities that we have as a community to change what's happening, not just locally, but perhaps on a national level. So I'm hoping that we all come away with a great message that I think that is going to be delivered here tonight. One thing I'm going to ask is that when we ask questions, that we give everybody in the room an opportunity. So if you've asked a question and someone else has their hand up, then it would be their turn. And I do ask that you ask a question instead of, and that you try to limit yourself to 1 to 2 minutes, if that would be okay. And that way we'll move it forward. We are going to conclude at 8:30, and then at that time we are going to continue on with our commission meeting, which you are welcome to stay for, but don't feel you have to at all. So, without too much more introduction, this is Chief Roger Peterson. He has been the Chief of Police in Rochester for quite some time, since 1998.
Yes.
So he's been the chief here since 1998. There have been people who have been chief for longer, but I think he's...
I'm not aware of that.
Okay, all right. So, I think that one of the things that Chief Peterson has been really active in connecting with everyone in the community. I think that he, as you'll see later, we have one of the founders of Rochester for Justice here, Mr. Melendez, and just, is able to work with great people in our community and I think make a difference. So, without further ado, Chief Peterson.
Obviously, a PowerPoint here. A couple of caveats before I get started. I am going to keep this to about 30 minutes. I am going to present some information to you. And for this first 28 minutes, what I'm going to tell you, there's no opinion. There's no value judgments being made here. I'm going to give you what the information on the law and different parts of the world, certainly what we're dealing with. That's not to offer you an opinion or anything else. When I get to the opinion part, I'll label it so you know. Now we're talking about what you think. I think it's important because there's been a lot of discussion about what side are you on. When we look at this policing issue and racial issues that are tied into this, and people are saying everything that has to do with what side of this issue. This is why I am really happy to be able to talk here in the Human Rights Commission, because what we're talking about is human rights, and we all are. We all are on the same side in that regard. I hope that as we go through this information, you'll see, and that'll make sense to you, at least in the context of what this is. This is what brings us here, is fatal police shootings. This is extremely misleading because what you see is how it's sometimes portrayed. That 3.1 and the 2.3 that I used the United States and the United Kingdom, and there's a reason for that. We'll explain here. But the difference is in the fine print, 3.1 a day in the U.S. are killed by the police, 2.3 a year in the United Kingdom. If you're wondering, it comes out to, those are the numbers, 1,134 people were killed by the police in the United States. In 2015, 2.3 is an average over the last 25 years in the United Kingdom. Those numbers came from The Guardian, London-based newspaper. Why a foreign newspaper is the source for police killings in the United States, because we don't keep track, I have no idea. I don't offer any answers to that one, but fortunately they went through, and if you like to see their methodology, they actually manually went through and counted in the news accounts to ensure they were duplicating numbers. This is what it looks like. No, I didn't just focus on the UK. Sometimes hard to get these numbers, but my point here, whether it's the United Kingdom, Germany, Australia, Canada, yes, I realize, I get the argument, it's, well, they don't have guns in the UK. Been there, that's not true, they do. The police don't have guns. Again, been there, they respond with firearms to thousands of instances, certainly in metropolitan London police department. The issue here is not that we're comparing different cultures, so to speak. The London Metropolitan Police Department responds to 27,000 incidents of people armed with knives and machetes, as we'll see, and swords. They didn't kill any of them. I think we're familiar with the fact that in the U.S. we do, and sometimes people that have no weapon at all. How did we get here? We started out in the same place. The U.S. and the U.K., of course, we being former colonies, we had the same system of law, and it was common law. Common law was if you were apprehending a felon and they ran and resisted, you could kill them. Why? Because felonies were punishable by death. So, a little time saver there. If they were running, we'll save the court time. That was actually the law in England, it was the law in the United States, and it was for a long time. And then, in 1945, at the conclusion of World War II, where there was a great focus, particularly in Europe, on the human rights aspect, there was, by the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of which we all signed. Europe and the U.S. is a signer to that. However, that's where we parted ways. Europe is a signer to the World Court. I'm going to oversimplify here, but the International Court, Criminal Court, what was the World Court. That's where Europe went. We have a Supreme Court. Not to argue the politics and back that, but the argument is we can't be subject, our citizens cannot be subject to the World Court because our Constitution prohibits it. Whether that's legal or not, again, I'm not offering opinions. That's led to two different standards when we talk about the use of deadly force. In Europe, where the World Court is the court that interprets that document of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the standard is strictly unavoidable. Cannot use firearm in those countries. The police cannot, unless it's strictly unavoidable. In the U.S., the standard, which until very recently, actually 1989, and I've been a police officer for 8 years by that time. In 1989, the court decided that actually, now you can't shoot fleeing felons. It's got to be reasonable. This is where it came from. Fourth Amendment standard. I don't expect you to read all that. I'm just going to point out what you need to know, because this is the standard in the U.S. Without regard to the underlying intent or motivation of the officer, and that is an important phrase in how this is interpreted. An incident when an officer uses deadly force must be judged from the perspective of an officer on the scene. That is a reasonable officer on the scene, not hindsight, not what the court might think, not what you might think as a community. And it's about that split-second decision when an officer makes the decision to use deadly force. Different standard from the World Court. Potential lethal force may only be made, and that's the key word, when it's strictly unavoidable. Is that the same standard? We'll see how it works. This is the UK. The gentleman that you're seeing in the center of the frame is a person in mental crisis. He is armed with a machete. Gentlemen that you see there, these officers around there, if you're wondering, yes, there are armed officers there. They have officers from their firearms detail, which have MP5s, automatic weapon. The guy with the machete, I'd like you to pay particular attention to the tactics being employed here, because this is something you don't see a lot. If you look when he advances on this officer and actually chases him, the officer runs. You ever see that on television? Not in this country. Now, I'm going to let that run just a little bit further so you can see how this ends. Basically, there's some time in the middle here. What happens is this guy gets tighter.
Are the officers doing something that they've been trained to do here? Or
Yes.
is this just a lucky circumstance?
No, this is what they're trained to do. They're avoiding this encounter, and the frame will skip here a little bit, and you'll see that the tactic here is after the gun is advancing now with plexiglass, right? You can't hurt them. And he goes to the hospital. Now, that's over there.
Do you remember which button it was on? Sorry, technical difficulty.
There you go. You didn't miss anything. There's a lot of unintelligent conversation there.
But this one has an important sound.
Well, this one, and I'm going to give you I'll give you a caveat that it's very graphic, and if you prefer not to watch, please don't. It's short, but graphic. So this is St. Louis, 10 days after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson.
Now, some police can pull up.
Person that you see there
Y'all police
has been reported as stealing 2 pastries from a shop, and he may have a gun, or excuse me, a knife in his pocket.
Oh, shit. Oh, shit. Oh, shit. Oh, shit. Oh, my God.
That was 14 seconds from the time the police exited their vehicle. What I would like you to notice is during that encounter, as opposed to what you saw the first time, police officers never took a step back. There were 12 shots fired. There was a 40-page report filed by the prosecutor in this case, indicating this was a legal, justified use of force by police.
Could you provide a little more detail? Did the... it's hard to-
Sir,
No, that's fine.
We are-
I'm going to...
we just asked that people hold questions until the
Oh.
end.
If I can be successful in making this advance, I'll get right to it. This is the law in Missouri and many other states. Again, you don't have to read that whole thing. I'll point out the important parts here, but in the Michael Brown decision, in that decision, Powell, this is the law that was relevant for the police officers. This says, in effecting an arrest,
We're live streaming.
someone who has committed or attempted to commit a felony, if that person is clean or may otherwise endanger life, the use of deadly force is authorized. Now, what we've seen repeatedly when these incidents happen is that there's the focus on what the police officers do, and only focus on that, because that's what we see. We see that 15 seconds of video. This was the law in Missouri. Why it was people were surprised when there were no charges that resulted. The law, whether or not it falls within what our expectations are, that's what a prosecutor could charge or not charge. And this, I want to draw a little contrast, because you're wondering how is that different between what's reasonable and what's strictly unavoidable? Well, this is the UK standard when you saw that other incident, and it says when absolutely necessary in self-defense or defense of others. It never references a felon or someone that's fleeing or apprehending anybody. It indicates, and this is the critical piece of this is not all about what officers did when they responded to a particular call or a particular incident. The standard from the World Court is police, and that means police management, police administration, people are responsible for training and policy, have to plan and control operations to minimize, to the greatest extent possible, recourse to lethal force. And such planning and control will include the provision to officers of a sufficient range of non-lethal equipment. What does that mean? Well, as you've seen in Ferguson, Michael Brown was killed. The prosecutor in that case said the officer had no other option to use other than his firearm. Why? Because the officer had left his taser at the station. His nightstick was inaccessible underneath the seat. He had no other options to use other than his firearm. Under the World Court standard, the human rights standard, is that okay? No, it is not. Is it okay under Missouri law or U.S. law? Yes, it is, because it doesn't count what administrators did or allowed or what the policy was or what equipment the officer had available. It's only that split second that they decide to use force that is at issue here. They also have a requirement for the availability of adequate medical expertise. So what's the difference? Why are we seeing a vastly different result in policing in different parts of the country? The first one, as I indicated, time. Under the human rights standard, everything counts. That is, all the administrative, managerial decisions, all the policy decisions, all the legislative decisions make a difference. That is, everything government does in terms of protecting human rights counts in this analysis. In the U.S., the only thing that counts is that split second that the officer decides to pull that trigger. The second, resources. Again, the human rights standard says a police officer has to have a full range of use of force options. That is, when we send an officer out and expect them to do a job and expect them to adhere to that human rights standard that you will only take life and it's absolutely unavoidable, you can't do that if you don't have all the tools in your toolbox. If all you got is a firearm, what are you going to use? The standard around the U.S., and I will say we've done a lot, continue to do a lot to make sure that officers on the Rochester Police Department have that full range of use of force. If you believe that that's a universal standard, nowhere close in this country. Management. The human rights standard applies to all of those managerial/government decisions. The U.S. standard only considers the decisions of the officer making that decision. The human rights standard requires accountability at all levels, at my level, at the local government level, at the state level, and the federal level, to ensure that we are adhering to those human rights standards. In the U.S., obviously, as you've seen repeatedly, this system is geared towards sanctioning officers or not, holding officers accountable or not, but not all of the mechanism and the system that goes into putting them in that situation. It's kind of a big issue. I asked you to, when you looked at that video from the UK, when officers being confronted by a person with a machete, the officers were running away from this guy. There's a lot of them around, and they were armed, but they were running away from this guy. The U.S. response, and back up a step, and in the prosecutor's evaluation in terms of whether that was legal or justified, there was no discussion about the officer's option to back up, or get back in the car, or back the car up, or produce more time. What the discussion was they estimated that Powell, who was armed with a knife, would have taken 1.2 to 2.4 seconds to reach the officer. And that trajectory, of course, was based on how fast could he have covered that ground, how immediate was the threat. That calculus nowhere included what if the officer was backing up at the same rate that this guy was advancing. Would that be a deadly threat? That is not considered, and I'm not faulting anybody in the math, because it's not a standard in the United States. It's not considered. If you're wondering, because we've always heard, okay, the state, the prosecutor in Missouri, or as we've seen in Minnesota and every other part of the country, we can't charge officers under this circumstance. They're within the law, justified penalty. So you always hear of well, there will be a federal investigation. The Department of Justice will do an investigation and determine then if civil rights were violated. And this is the statute that applies under colored law. There's only one word that is really a dead issue here, and that is that one that says willfully. You can't have the civil rights violation, which there are severe penalties for, but you can't have the civil rights violation unless somebody willfully violates somebody's constitutional rights. The paradox is once you are sanctioned by state law that what you've done is legal under state law, that's gone. That's not a willful violation of somebody's constitutional rights, because you were actually in compliance with the law that you were working, the jurisdiction you were working in. This is actually the jury instructions in that Section 242 violation of civil rights. I got this just to illustrate the point when we wonder why there wasn't, the Department of Justice didn't pursue civil rights violations in these cases. And again, you don't have to read all of that. But this is actually the language that is used under Section 242. A law enforcement officer is justified in the use of any force which he, and I'm not outlining for the sexist language, but which he reasonably believes to be necessary to effect arrest or hold someone in custody, and of any force which he reasonably believes to be necessary to defend himself or another from bodily harm. Okay, you're the prosecutor. Think you're going to win that one? So we're left with the civil standard. Okay, they're not going to be charged under state law. They're not going to be charged under federal law. But we still have the civil recourse to sue the officer that was responsible for that, pulling the trigger in that circumstance. This is the immunity from liability means that a police officer being sued in federal court for a civil rights violation, there's the determination made before they go to trial as to whether they can be sued, whether they're immune from suit, and this is the standard. In order to sue a police officer successfully in federal court, you have to demonstrate that only a plainly incompetent officer, one who knowingly violated the law, and I would submit that you've already crossed those bridges with the state and federal criminal sanctions, that knowingly violating the law is not relevant in this case. Plainly incompetent.
Is it the same in state court?
State, you can sue for negligence, and I will tell you that police officers never get sued in state court. Why? Because there's statutory maximums as to what can be recovered in state court, and frankly, because there's no statutory maximum in federal court, an attorney's not wasting their time in state court. So how does this play itself out? This case is a case, this occurred in Texas. A deputy sheriff was chasing an individual on the interstate highway, a person fleeing in their vehicle. The one deputy sheriff decided that an appropriate way to end this chase would be to get up on an overpass and use a high-powered rifle to shoot the vehicle and therefore stop it. That took place even though the deputy's supervisor said, no, don't do that. It went to the Supreme Court on that same standard, immunity from liability. The decision of the court was, let's see there, they have never made a decision. Officers in a high-speed chase selected one dangerous alternative over another. There's no constitutional violation in doing that. Deputy fired 6 rounds. He struck the driver 4 times, killing him. If you're wondering how the evolution of the law is taking place here, I draw attention to this. That's a 2015 case. That's like right now. That's what the law is. Again, as a little contrast, the European Court of Human Rights, that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as indicated in their articles, decide whether the use of deadly force is actually necessary or whether it is strictly unavoidable according to that standard. This case from 1995 was a case, this incident occurred in Gibraltar. There were 3 people that had been identified as terrorists that were going to set off a car bomb to disrupt a military ceremony and parade in Gibraltar. They had been tracked by British intelligence, and 3 British SAS officers were dispatched on this detail in order to apprehend them. They surveilled them for a considerable period of time, and in the course of surveillance, as they were tailing them through a highly populated area of Gibraltar, there was an inadvertent siren that was activated by another officer. The terrorists reacted quickly to that, feeling they had identified the SAS soldiers that were there, who then tried to apprehend them. The terrorists reached inside their coat. The SAS officers believed that they were reaching for a detonator to detonate that car bomb, and they shot 2 of them and engaged 1 later and shot and killed. All 3 terrorists were killed. It's not an issue that they were terrorists, and not an issue that that's the activity they were engaged in. The World Court found that this did not meet the standards, the human rights standard. Again, not because they faulted the SAS soldiers, not because it was wrong of them to react under that situation in what they felt was an imminent threat to life. But they pointed out the fact that the decisions made in this, going back to the time that these terrorists entered Gibraltar, that the government knew of their activities, that they could have at any time stopped and interceded in that and avoided the loss of life. This was a management decision. It was a policy decision, not by officers in the field, but by people who could have interceded and stopped this from happening before those soldiers were put in that position. You're wondering, I hope you're wondering now, as part of this discussion, if we recognize this dynamic, that we are in a position where we're not adhering to what that human rights standard is, well, why don't you, Mr. Police Chief, make sure that your department is and have a use of force standard that does meet those requirements? And this, I put this in here for that purpose. Again, not so you read and understand the whole law, but basically what the state law requires is that we have a policy on the use of deadly force, and that policy can be no more restrictive than what that state law is. That is, whatever we want as a community, whatever I might think might be appropriate as a police chief, there's not a discretionary issue here. It is what it is, and we are seeing this across the country, that the standard for the use of deadly force is not something that's left to anybody's discretion. It's a legal standard that we can't be more restrictive. All right, how much time did I have in that now? I'm thinking about 28 minutes. Deep close. Now, opinion. I'm going to label it as such. Everything I've said to this point, I've given you actually just slides on what the law says and plenty of those things. Here's the issue. We have, as a department, we have faced a lot of policy issues on what's the best way to police the community. And respecting that sanctity of life standard. For instance, we have a pursuit policy, a high-speed chase policy, which we reviewed more than a decade ago. And what was happening was we had officers, somebody would go through a stop sign, an officer would try to stop them, they take off, the police officer chases them. So we have a car going 80 miles an hour through downtown, and we have a squad car chasing it at 80 miles an hour, and we have a lot of squad cars helping that are going through 80 miles an hour and putting all of you in jeopardy. So we had a discussion, and we said that's not a good policy on the public safety standard. So we said, basically, don't chase anybody unless it's imminent that life is in danger if you don't stop them immediately. It's a standard. It means don't do that unless it's, quote, strictly unavoidable. We don't have that option for the use of fire. We have it for a car. Let me frame this conversation for you. Because when we talk, and we do, when we have use of force incidents, we review those. When police officers get into a car accident, as administration, we review them. And the discussion is about whether or not that accident was avoidable or unavoidable. And it's not all about whether that officer could have done something different. It's about, for instance, you have a traffic accident, and was the car, were the lights on the car, are they good enough? Is it really visible? Can we avoid this in some way? Is there something we can do from the standpoint of policy, as I described? Can we do something from the standpoint of equipment that would avoid that? Let me frame this policy. I'm going to show you, hopefully, to contrast these. Let's take that discussion that we had over whether a traffic accident would be unavoidable, because there's not a lot of emotions tied to that. There's not racial issues tied to that. There's not all of the what we're hearing in terms of political rhetoric tied to that. Well, let's just take that discussion and say, as we look at it, is there a way to avoid this outcome? Because we look at a traffic accident where people are hurt and we say, you know what, regardless of whether or not that was unavoidable, it's certainly not what we want to have happen, right? That's not the outcome we want. So the discussion when we have that is around that issue, is it avoidable or not? Now let me just substitute some words here, because we don't talk about unavoidable when we talk about use of a firearm. We talk about justified, not justified. So let's take that traffic accident. This is our staff meeting. Chief, we had an accident last night. A car went through a stop sign, and an officer tried to stop that car, and a pursuit engaged. And the officer turned on the red lights, and the other car went through a red light intersection, and the officer went through, and there was a family coming the other way, and they met at the intersection, T-boned, and the family there hurt, and the officer seriously hurt. Wow, that sounds terrible. Did the officer violate any laws? Well, no, sir, because an officer can go through a red light as long as they turn their red lights on, siren, and that the person in the other car has got a right, an obligation to yield to that emergency vehicle. No laws were broken. Well, thank goodness. No laws were broken, so that was justified. It's a tragedy, but we don't have to change anything. Can you imagine having that discussion? Do you realize that's the discussion that we're having when an officer uses a firearm as opposed to driving a vehicle? The discussion is whether it's justified, whether it's legally justified. Was it legal? Did the officer break any laws? No. Well, it was justified. It's a tragedy. It's justified. My point is, we are approaching these issues with the wrong language. It's not about whether it's justified, whether it's avoidable. We've had that discussion around use of vehicles. We can certainly have that discussion around firearms. But we should never be putting officers in a situation where they do not have the resources to make other choices. We should never put officers in a situation where they don't have the full range of equipment to use to avoid use of deadly force. We should never put officers in a position of being responsible for the decisions of policymakers and legislators. And we should never have a situation where we are not only legally obligated, but cannot legally change that policy to what you expect as a community. The math isn't hard on this one. That's what this is about, and I'm hoping that that's where the focus will be. This was said by the Peterson police chief in November before the grand jury decision was rendered, and this is the one that incensed me most because the officer involved, he indicated, would immediately return to duty if not indicted for a felony. I was incensed. Why? Because this basically told the world, we have set the standard that if you do not commit a felony in the line of duty, that's pretty much what our standard for policing is in the country. In retrospect, what continues to incense me is he was right. That is the standard. Just my Uncle Albert. And we've seen this time and time again. We've seen these incidents occur over and over again. And we're repeatedly told, wait for the legal process to play out. What will that legal process be? We will wait 6 months for a prosecutor to issue a determination or a grand jury to say, no, that's actually not a violation of state law, there will be no state prosecution. We'll say, we'll get the federal Department of Justice to investigate from civil rights. I told you what the law is and what the jury instruction would be. There will not be federal charges in that case. And will there be a civil suit? Probably. Will there be money paid? Probably, because municipalities just want to avoid that circumstance. Is that a solution? That's why we're here talking about it. We've got to do better than that. And I'm hopeful. I want to but there is one quote that I would like to read. President Obama said last week, as we've seen across the country, the goal of protest isn't just a protest for the sake of protesting. The goal of protest is to then get the attention of decision makers and sit down and say, here's what we would like to see. I think that's where we are. Kamau is here. He's, frankly, in my opinion, he's done his part. He's brought it to the attention of decision makers. Now it's time for us, and it's a human rights issue. I did not include race in this discussion, not because I'm trying to avoid it, I'm not saying it's not part of this. We all know that standard is when an officer is reasonably in fear, and if they fear a minority more than they do somebody else, is that likely to produce a disparity? We're saying, yeah, I get that. But it's not about whether we can take 1,200 deaths a year and feel better because only 1 out of 3 of them is a minority. We did not kill 1,200 people a year. So, 32.
Thank you very much, Judy. I appreciate that. And I hope that you know, as we understand, if 2 out of 3 people in our country are being killed a day are people of color, that's not okay. Is it better if 2 out of 3 of those people are white? No, it's not okay. We have a greater goal that we need to work on, and I think that everyone in the community can hopefully get behind that goal. I would like to have our other panelists come up and join us. Representative Liebling has been a champion of human rights since I've known her. She serves on the House since 2002. For quite a few years. Has been on 12 years, 12 years, 14 years.
You've done this so long, you forgot.
And really, whenever there's a human rights issue, I never need to worry where Representative Liebling will be landing. So I know that she always has everyone's back. Also, I'd like to introduce Mr. Kamau Landis, if you would come up. Kamau Landis is Rochester for Justice founder. He is a champion of human rights in this community and has been a champion of human rights since 12 years of age, where you walked in a march, I believe, for Native people, and have walked to take back the night marches as well. What all 3 panelists have in common may not be obvious. They're all musicians, actually. So most people wouldn't recognize. Now, Roger doesn't really sing, but Kamau, do you sing? Actually?
A little bit, probably more in the shower.
So I think that actually speaks to that we have people who are not just passionate about justice, who are not just articulate in what they do, but who also, I think, are, let's see everybody here as a creative person. And I think that I'm hoping that everyone in the community here today cares enough to be here so that we can all work together and be creative and make a difference. So I would like, if people have questions for the panel, they would be most welcome. And Jennifer, I'll start with you.
You know, I was listening to some news about the recent stop and death in St. Anthony, and the news was talking about the disproportionality of the population and the population of that community, the number of African American people in the community, the number of stops that African American people are subjected to, and Philandro Castile himself was stopped over 50 times in a very short period of time, and I think it was a 10-year period. Has anyone done the math or the research or the calculus, as we heard earlier, on our community's racial makeup and the racial makeup of the people being stopped in our community, the arrests in our community? Do we know that information about what's happening here in Rochester?
No. I think it's fair to say that with all of the emphasis on data collection and the issues surrounding that, we've made a really big investment in the intelligence-led policing aspect. That is what we can use data for in order to improve what we do. I think that there's been a lot of concerns about what data we collect and how we use it. I think one of the greatest benefits would be to use it to determine where disparities exist and how those can be addressed effectively. That's one of the greatest benefits of the technology that I see coming. Right now, I'm just talking to Ray Schmitz, a former county attorney, who read a story in the News Tribune about stops, and both of us are unaware of any way to get that information except manually looking at every arrest that's made. And when our resources are stressed to the point they are, that's a really difficult thing to accomplish. So I'm thinking that's one of the areas that we can certainly do better.
I remember though, some years ago, where there was an effort, it was a statewide pilot program of some kind, where that data was collected. I don't know if it was collected across the state or just in certain departments, for a short period of time.
It was yes, it was a 1-year period of time, I believe it was 2004.
Okay.
And yes, I don't think any surprises. There was disparities in stops. There were disparities in searches that were conducted. We saw the results of that, I think, where we wound up, and I don't mean to tell you that we ignored that, we actually changed some policies, particularly around searches, consensual searches, and those things, that I think there was a clear indication of a low return as well as a significant disparity, so we just quit those practices. But you're right, that's been over a decade, and I think that was one of the things that we had data, it was brought to our attention, and that went away.
And Mr. Werner, I believe you had.
The idea of local control is something that I think that is spoken highly of in both the Democratic and the Republican Party. Do you think maybe the state law should be changed so that cities or municipalities can have their own policy about deadly use of force?
Well, I want to be clear about that. That Universal Declaration of Human Rights was at the conclusion of World War II. We've had 70 years to actually abide by that promise, to keep that promise. And we haven't chosen as a country to do that. I don't think it should be every police chief deciding what the standard is for their office. I don't believe it should be any more than it should be an individual decision on the part of an officer. I think that standard needs to be what our expectations are as a nation. We either are going to abide by that human rights declaration, or let's quit pretending we are and say that it's, that's not something we subscribe to. I'm not saying we've got to join the world court. I'm not sure. We've got to get on the same page here that, human rights are exactly that.
And then, and then Mr.
Representative Liebling, what are the barriers, if you could possibly elaborate a little bit, what the barriers are to get these kinds of things, which, as Chief Peterson has pointed out, are basically common sense and basically human rights, just basic human rights. We're not talking about special circumstances. What are the barriers to changing those laws?
Wow, well, that's a great question. And, well, let me first just say that when I heard the presentation, and I had a little bit of forewarning of what it was going to be about, but it just absolutely takes my breath away. I absolutely feel sick about that, what we've done, and that, but let me just say too that and immediately I started to think about that very thing, how we get from here to there. And that Chief Peterson in the past has worked with me on some other kinds of policies with the legislature. I'm sure he's as aware as I am that it can be extremely difficult to make change in these areas. And one of the biggest impediments to change, I would say, is that we have organizations, I would call them kind of big police, as we say, big coal and big oil, and we have big police. And I want to be careful that I don't, there are organizations that lobby at the Capitol for big police. They don't necessarily represent the views of police officers, rank and file officers. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But they can be a really big impediment to change. Now, this is one that I don't know, but, hadn't really thought about it in these terms. I did look up the law in Minnesota on use of deadly force, and I didn't bring it with me, but I think it uses the term necessary. It has to be necessary to do X, Y, and Z, which I didn't see in the Missouri law that we looked at here. But nevertheless, the point is still the same point. Maybe it's not quite as egregious, but, if a felony is not a death penalty offense, felonies have been kind of, we've ratcheted up a lot of things over the years that are, felonies that we didn't used to think were felonies. And there's constantly a push in the legislature to be tough on crime. I mean, you wouldn't think that that would still be the case, but it is, because, it's really easy to legislate based on incidents that happen to people. So when you have somebody in front of you where there was an incident, where something happened, and the current law didn't seem to produce a big enough penalty to make that family feel whole, or make that victim feel whole, you're going to get a push to increase the penalties, or put in a new law, or, and it seems to me that so often it's kind of a one-way ratchet. And not always, but it's really difficult, because, legislators are politicians, and politicians are afraid of what their constituents are going to say, and nobody wants to be called soft on crime. So I can only imagine if we could get the organized police groups in the state to be on board with changing the standard, that would make it a whole lot easier to do. But if you have to be pushing against them to make change that's going to affect them, it's very, very hard to get legislators to go along with that.
I think it's, it's really the point of how difficult it is to do this change. I think we can all agree there needs to be some change. I can tell you what shouldn't be, and what you shouldn't be buying at this point, because the reason that this is entitled as it is the White House, the Department of Justice, issued a report on policing in the 21st century. And there's these 9 pillars, and since all these shootings have occurred and these tragedies have occurred, we've heard everything that was said in that report, and there's nothing to disagree with in there. But that was a political process. So anything that was controversial, as Tina says, either to one constituency or another, was pretty much distilled out of there. And what you have is, you should do community policing. You should have good relations with people in your community. You should encourage, interaction and support from people in the community and businesses. All wild, radical things like that. What I've heard from, the political rhetoric in here is that, for instance, in response to the Philando Castile shooting, was we need to do community policing. That was a response from Kamau. Now, I am an advocate of community policing, don't get me wrong. But employing the same philosophy that we have for the last 30 years, with the expectation that's going to change the dynamic that we're seeing, I will refer to Uncle Albert again, or just do the math. The chances of the thousands of police officers in the Twin Cities and the millions of people that they police, that the officer that pulled over Philando Castile would say, oh, it's Philando, I don't need to shoot him. That's not a solution. Likewise, we've heard police need more training. Yeah, and again, I am a huge advocate of police training. My point here is, though, if we keep training to the same standards that we are required to do, we're going to keep getting the same result. Again, my Uncle Albert will, support that. It is not, and what I hope that we can get across here is we as a society, and we in the political role, we really like simple solutions to really complex or really bad problems. I mean, that's great. And when we say things that aren't controversial, like community policing and police training, and yeah, but really, we can't keep putting officers out there because, as I said, we're not giving them the resources they need. We're not giving them the staffing they need. We're not giving them the tools that they need. And we're seeing time and time again the result of that. It's time that, frankly, people like me, and people like Tina and at the federal level, that we step up and say, you know, this isn't, we can't keep blaming this on the people that are being put in this situation. It's our responsibility to make sure this happens. To me, it's not a change. We made this promise 70 years ago. We're gonna keep it or not. That's where we are. And I don't think that's, as I said, that's not a radical, we need to completely change the paradigm in this country. We need to change the paradigms in policing, but those paradigms have come from what we as management and we as legislature and policymakers have. That's what we give to people to go out and do that job. If we want that to change, we have to change.
I might add to that too, that like, it also has to do with communities, right? And us, everybody in the state, making sure that we're putting pressure on the right people. And we do that through our vote, we do that through organizing meetings like this, and we make sure that we're aware of the problem. I think one of the biggest things is that the pushback normally is that this isn't really a problem, it doesn't exist, right? I mean, that's the fight. The fight is, and I have the unfortunate duty to bring race into the discussion, but the idea is if you look at every single one of these instances, the ones that have caused national rancor or even state rancor, is the idea that a lot of people don't want to believe that there's anything wrong. And when you have a huge majority of people, a massive number of people that can't even admit that we have a problem, then the reality is that even democratically, we have a difficult time making the changes that we need, getting the right legislators in office, getting the right people out of office. It does have to do with us and making a decision that this is a problem that we need to stop, right? And I would reattach that to the idea of the culture of the police, right? The police departments all across the United States, is that we've become accustomed to the idea that it's okay for them to run ramshot over communities. And I think that it all coincides with the idea of, if we're not going to admit that we have a problem, we're going to be okay with police officers who don't act with dignity in our communities, then we're really fighting ourselves. Right? And I've been kind of saying a lot with the recent election to people about the idea that we get the democracy that we demand. And we see that in our presidential candidates, and we can see that in our police departments. So I think that it has a lot to do with whether or not we have the difficult conversations that like this as a community. It starts here.
Going off of what Chief Peterson his whole presentation makes me think that what we've done when we have set it up the way we have, and we put police officers in this sort of situation to make these kind of split-second, this culture of only go forward, never back up. We've created a culture that just, all these, the racism piece feeds in there, but it's not the only piece. We've created a culture here where police probably, I don't know what police think or don't think, but, I can only imagine that, we've created this kind of militaristic force, which is kind of the opposite of what is meant by community policing, right? But you can't just get away from it just by saying, let's do community policing. Because I think your point is very well made. This isn't only the responsibility of the individual officer. It's a whole structure that's set up that creates a mindset.
And that's kind of what I mean too, about the idea of like a culture of humanity, right? American culture of that we're okay with the Rambo, we're okay with the John McClane, diehard cop, and I think we've really changed our mentality from the local police officer that we trust and know, and to this idea that it's okay to John McClane and yippee-ki-yay into a situation, and that we don't really see anything inherently wrong with it, because for most of my lifetime, every cop movie I've ever seen since Dirty Harry, and we've been completely okay with abusing rights, and CSI and those kind of shows kind of change our perspective of what we believe police officers really, their duties
What
actually
makes someone a hero?
Yeah.
Those guys that we saw standing back from the knife-wielding person, we don't think they're heroes.
No, it's not part of the culture.
And I'm just going to interrupt you because this gentleman has been waiting so long to ask a question.
It doesn't seem like it's that hard a problem to solve. We shouldn't be focused on our television shows. We should be focusing on a program to change policing along the, you know how to do it. You know, and you've demonstrated with your video how skillful police operate in Great Britain. It seems to me very doable to describe such a program, to establish the resources necessary to implement it, to provide those resources, to do the training over a period of years to get a different behavior in the police and corresponding changes, positive reactions from the community. Now, is it feasible, perhaps not in Rochester alone, but is it feasible if the Minnesota legislature had a firm resolve to implement a program described in a 20-page white paper? Is it feasible for policing to change in important ways in Minnesota by the action of the Minnesota legislature?
And you don't think that the people, we need to demand that?
No, is it Is it possible for the legislature to accomplish that? As far as how will it happen from this gentleman's work, but is it a matter of structure and law and policy and so forth? Wouldn't the state of Minnesota be able to take a 20-page white paper that's very specific, detail how to implement Great Britain here, more or less, and with their adequate resources to get something done in the state? Is that a feasible path?
Let me address first from the local level, because when we talk about these issues, is this feasible? Because one of the issues we're talking about is, are we as a community, as a nation, going to make those resources available to achieve that objective? When we had the discussion on a local level here in regard to resources, police staffing, and I asked last year for additional police officers, which I had asked for the 5 previous years for and didn't get. The discussion though was, look, I had 14 police officers hurt, couldn't work on light duty or couldn't work at all. That's not 14 over the course of the year, that was 14 at one time. 14 off duty at one time in the peak of July. And the reason was that in most of these cases, it was because those officers were responding to calls that they could not, they were getting hurt. They didn't have enough police officers there to avoid it. What happens in that circumstance is it's not just police officers that get hurt. The public gets hurt because the only option they have under those circumstances is to ramp up the level of force that they use to control it. The council responded to that, and we have a council that is very supportive of public safety. But I got additional officers. We all know that we're a growing community, and we're not keeping pace. We're not keeping pace with that call. So that in terms of the resources available to actually make that happen, and that's just maintaining the status quo. That's not introducing the change that we want to see happen. When we look at it on the state level, it's one thing to mandate it, it's another thing to actually provide the resources to do it. As Tina referenced, one of the greatest impediments to change is that as soon as you say change, it means somebody's doing something wrong. And particularly people that have invested their lives in it, as I have. For somebody to say, well, you know what? All that you have invested in and sworn to and what you dedicated your life to, yeah, not so much, you're wrong. That's a tough one, okay? It's not a question, though, where officers have been wrong. The problem is they're doing exactly what we're asking them to do. That's what we got to change.
But as a matter of, I know there's a difficulty of the political will, as a matter of structure, is it a reasonable goal? If the legislature had the will to do it, could they do it?
The rest of the world, the rest of Europe was able to do that.
Yeah, so the answer would be yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Unequivocally.
That means that's a reachable goal.
Dave Beal.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my back is hurting, so I'm not grimacing at you. One, great presentation, I appreciate you sharing that. Is this the one you gave to the commission then, that we read about in the paper?
More or less.
Okay. It seems to me that the law, the disparities of the law are clear. We can clearly see what the consequences of those disparities are. But the law comes into force once the officer has used deadly force. And the officer then is judged on what he has done or she has done in that split second. Now, and we can see the consequences of that standard, but and I think this goes back to the gentleman's question. It seems to me you've got some leeway in terms of the non-lethal resources you provide to your officers when they go out. That the law does not limit you to do that, but you do that. I'm just assuming you do that, so they have those options, so they're not stuck in a situation where the only thing I can do is shoot somebody. Do you have similar options in terms, and I do think it goes back to this, and I understand there's a resource question, to go, there's training involved. I can train that, yeah, my officer, if he uses force or deadly force, will be judged on those standards, and it will create those disparities. But are there things we can do, as we may try to change those standards? I think that's a much harder thing to do. In training to go, I'm going to better prepare my officers in Rochester.
Yep.
And maybe you're doing that to go, you know, if we do this, if we back off, if we create that culture that backs off, that these are sort of procedural, I guess, questions. Even, you'll still be judged. So I'm not training you to the split-second decision, because the law doesn't say I have to shoot. The law doesn't say you've got to shoot the guy. The law says if you shoot the guy, this is what we're going to judge you on. But there's nothing in the law that compels the officer to shoot. That to me just seems to be a function of how the officer is trained. And the other things that you alluded to, and that eventually come into play, like how do I respond differently, and that's where the racial differentiation, I assume, comes in, and those kinds of perceptions. Are there things we can do locally? And this seems to me to be the policy question, that can take advantage of what we know about how to reduce the likelihood that the officer will feel compelled to shoot. That might help us better, make that less likely, because the officer has a better training, better resources, that he's not in the situation. So, and that's within the law, and I think you know what I'm going to say.
I do, but let me respond, because I know that we desperately want to be able to say, if we train our officers, as you're describing, in a certain way, that we will not have this problem. Now, here's my dilemma. In order to train, I have to have a policy to train you to. And that policy is dictated by state law that says not only is there no duty to retreat, as you suggest, there's no expectation. And indeed, culturally, as Kamau has indicated, I mean, I grew up watching Gunsmoke. I never saw Matt Dillon take a step back. And I'm not, that's just part culturally, where not only is there that cultural belief, but there's also both on the expectations of the community. That is when they call the police officer and I have, you know, the intruder in my house, or, you know, the incident that's taking place. Well, they're not going to be backing up. That's not what I call them for. And likewise, an officer is extremely concerned about what happens to me if I back up? Because I'm not meeting the expectations, and if this person goes and does something because I didn't use that force, they hurt somebody else, what happens to me? Am I liable for that? Yeah. Or it's my job, and yeah, your job's in there. That's what we have to look at in terms of not just changing a policy, not just changing the law, but changing that culture, as Kamau suggests. We need a different standard here. And if we really are focused on the sanctity of life, then we have to be able to say to the community, that's our expectation, and that's what we're going to support in you doing.
Can I just do one quick follow-up? Because it does seem to me, though, I agree, I don't think we should have individual community standards. I think we need and those are mainly at the level of the state. But there does seem to me to be some diversity, at least in the conversation as I can follow in the news, that different localities do have different kinds of trainings, like de-escalation. That they do, even under this standard. Well, that seems to me to be a conversation to have. I know we're not going to work it out now, but what kind of room do we actually have to institute things we know might work and reduce that livelihood within the law and those other kinds of issues? Because right now, frankly, you seem to be describing a situation that's irresolvable in any real way anytime soon. And I'm not blaming you for that, because that's just what you're trying to
I think that It needs to be.
Yeah.
But I'm going to use that as an example because we use the training escalation,
Yeah.
and there's certainly a focus on that. Our department has embarked on training officers on critical incident intervention, which is actually a pretty significant commitment to training that every officer has to commit an entire week to this training that involves the identification of mental illness and appropriate interventions or strategies in order to de-escalate people in a situation. Now, as Tina is aware, last year at the legislature, there was a bill introduced not to require 40 hours of training for every officer, but 4 hours of training so a peace officer would be at least be able to identify rudimentary identify mental illness and hopefully employ some type of de-escalation. 4 hours worth. It didn't pass. And it didn't pass because, well, there's another unfunded mandate. Come on, do we really need to, are we going to make that commitment or not? I mean, this is where we get to that fundamental argument. We have this commitment to human rights, but a commitment doesn't mean money or that we're actually committed to doing that. It means that, yeah, we're in favor of money.
So could I ask you a question? If do you see a downside? If we were able to go and change this policy, what will the pushback be other than we don't want to, it's not the way we're used to doing things? Is there when I go charging in to change something, I usually like to have some idea of what's going to come back the other way. Have you thought about that?
If you charge into the legislature and say you want to change this law regarding the use of force in the state, you will instantly hear you're going to put police officers' lives in jeopardy. And you're going to put the public's lives in jeopardy because if the police officers actually back up from the situation, then the public will be at risk. I heard during the course of, as you're aware of, with legislation that was proposed only last year, but in years past, where that was the very argument. And what was stated by the organizations you're talking about was that law will make officers hesitate before they use force or before they use deadly force. It will actually pause to think about that. And I was thinking at the time, is that really they're going to think before they pull the trigger? Is that a bad thing? But the implications are if there's hesitation, then the police officer is going to get hurt. What I would really stress in the argument is that we repeatedly see, and I refer you to those statistics, I refer you to those videos. Great Britain didn't lose any officers. I mean, the officers that they've lost in the last few years have been off-duty incidents, traffic accidents on the way to work, those kind of things. Those happen. But there is a way to police. That doesn't mean that we weigh, okay, we'll lose less citizens, so we're going to lose more police officers. That's not the equation. If we actually put the resources into this, there's a way to do this. It protects officers and it protects citizens. The last thing I want, and I know I got some of my staff here, the thing that they're dreading is being in one of those situations that they have to use deadly force. They know that's going to ruin their career. It's going to ruin their life. We've seen that across the country. Last thing in the world they want to have happen. Last thing in the world I want to have happen. And I told everybody who wants to listen, there's 2 kinds of police chiefs in this country. Police chiefs that have had this kind of thing happen in their community, and those that are wondering when it will, because we don't change the standards that make that a reality.
We've got 3 questions that are coming. We're going to have Mr. Juritz, Lieutenant Pierre, and then Ms. Winters.
So this kind of piggybacks off of Representative Liebling's statement. I remember going up against the brick wall of big police when doing the Mexican consular ID. And I'm just wondering if you have any advice, not just for Representative Liebling, but for community organizers in the Rochester community on what kind of messaging would work best in addressing this issue with big police.
And, okay, I'm going to label it strictly personal opinion here.
Yeah.
as I said, I think the community has referred to by the president, where they brought this attention, this is brought to our attention policy. I think the most effective strategy is to focus on this is a human rights issue. This is a promise that we've already made. It's one that we need to keep to our citizens. This is not about blaming this officer. This is not about Republicans or Democrats. It's not about taking a side, Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter. We're all on the same side. Can we not get together and say we shouldn't be killing people?
As Americans, we're not okay with 3 Americans being killed per day by police.
The standard, and I think when we think about it as a community, where that phrase is used, whether using a firearm is strictly unavoidable, there's a big chasm between reasonable and necessary. Strictly unavoidable means that you employ every means from the moment that we pass legislation to the moment the decision that officer has to make. That's everything. And we really need to look at that as a systemic problem, not simply, okay, let's blame that officer. If we can get rid of that officer, we're good. Our problem is solved. That's all.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I have a quick
Okay.
follow-up. So essentially what I'm hearing is, aside from framing it in a human rights context, also framing it in a context where it is to take the burden off of the individual officers.
And put it on the legislature.
From the standpoint
It's
of,
their deal.
as we've repeatedly seen, that, and it's not to say, we've seen officers do horrible things. I mean, there's been the videos out there that are indefensible. I'm not suggesting that they're defensible. But when we look at the number of incidents, and we say, for instance, well, that's because police officers are racist. My experience in Europe, UK, there's not a lack of bias or discrimination in those countries. That is not a unique product of the United States. They have found a way to police where they're not, it's not killing people. And I'm not trying to avoid the race issue, but I am saying that as a human rights issue, if we are, Nora suggested, if we become complacent because the numbers are more representative, the numbers don't go down, they're just more representative of the minority population, that's not a solution. It's 3 people a day. That's way too many, and that doesn't happen in the rest of the world, and it needs not to happen here. That's my point. And it's not about, I'm not trying to suggest that when we look at these incidents, there shouldn't be accountability by officers. I am suggesting, though, that people like me and policymakers in this discussion, we've flown under the radar way too long, way too long.
Lieutenant up here?
There's been some talk about what we can do for training and stuff, but that's what we need to address. From the standpoint of what we can do without legislation to step forward, or police unions to even agree. I wonder what you think about no longer sending officers to things like street survival. I know that sounds really good, and it's the most popular training that our officers want to go to is street survival training, but having attended that training, it's video after video after video about the most unique, crazy, this person is going to shoot you under this circumstance, so you better be prepared. It's video after video of us shooting back, and it's really presents an us versus them video. There's another one, The Warrior's Mind, that a lot of officers love. Treating us like we're soldiers and going against the community, not necessarily against, but you know what I mean, separating us from the community. I think this is very problematic in policing when it becomes us versus them. There's also Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman, who speaks about sheep's wolves and sheepdogs, and it's just classifying people, our community, and making them less human by these titles that we're giving people. And I think that's problematic. And those are things that can change right here on RPD.
If I can kind of address that, I think like, you know, the us versus them is problematic for Black Lives Matter, right?
Yeah.
Rochester Justice is that, you know, when you talk about the people, it's like this use of force continuum, right? That's how things escalate, whether or not we're taking the appropriate steps. Basically, what Black Lives Matter is saying is we're fed up with it, right? We're making that stand first. Why? Because we're most affected by it. So naturally, we're going to be the first people, minorities and black people are going to be the first people to say enough is enough, right? And until we connect that with it, it's not an issue of all Black Lives Matter hates the police, right? That we want to be policed a certain way until everybody starts connecting that, right? And that it is in the best interest of all people, that we're going to continually be fraught with this idea that it is us versus them. But as you can see, we're working together here in Rochester to try and create the policies, meaningful policies that help, you know, put us all in a position where this doesn't happen in our city, or if it does happen in our city, we have proper avenues, we have a connection to the community, so we can all be safer, including police officers. But the rhetoric that we hear, like that nice sheriff from Milwaukee, is that everything that we do is vitriolic hate. It's hate speech. We're a terrorist organization, without any true understanding of what the core of the message is, and that the hundreds of thousands of protests that have gone across the United States have all been peaceful. We've only had a couple of examples in Baltimore, in Ferguson, and you know, there's only a few examples where they've actually blown up into serious violence. But the way that they've been painted is that it's us versus them, and so then we no longer have a dialogue. Then we cannot engender change, and so the thumb is stuck directly on top of us because we are not the majority. And you know, I think that when we talk about the idea of this is about human rights, I think that's, you know, the riot and the protest is the voice of the voiceless, that we're trying to speak out because we are under that ultimately more oppression than white folks, right? And so we're the first ones to say enough is enough. And now I think slowly, as we start to see more examples of just flat out where everybody can see this is wrong without asking the first question that pops in everybody's head, which is, what did he do, right? We didn't see the whole video, right? People are starting to see because we can record it. People are starting to be like, yeah, this is getting ridiculous. It's every day. Every day we see some macabre horror film. We see every day some person getting killed, generally a black person on film. Like it's like something that we, as a culture, have just become accustomed to. I mean, my own child it's almost like he doesn't even understand it, or he's not even, it's like a movie to him. I don't think he necessarily at this point is really connected to it the way I would assume somebody would be, and I think the rest of society. So I think that a lot of people have to understand that in order for us to do this, we have to start listening to those that are most effective to abide it, and have talked about it, well, really for 100 years, right? And since we've talked about it and studied it and researched it as a class, that's what black people have done for so long, since before Martin Luther King, then perhaps we might have some expertise on how to solve this problem, because we can identify what that problem is. But if we're like, yeah, well, we don't really believe everything that you say, what else can we do? Then we're gonna slow down the process. Instead of bringing everybody along and getting everybody involved in it, we slow this process down. And so, like, there's a lot of, honestly, white folks that are, like, for the first time asking the question, well, what do we do? Right? Well, meanwhile, entire generations of families have been saying for a long time, this has to stop. So we got to work together on it.
Well, what do you think of the chief's proposal? I mean, does that seem to you, I mean, as he said in his presentation, he's not directly addressing the racial piece, but I can certainly see that if we could make the kinds of changes that he's proposing, it would certainly, at least people would maybe stop dying, and then we can move on to the next level of making a change.
And I agree with the idea of changing the overall federal law, right? The state and federal law, that's what has to occur. Otherwise, we can try and create police oversight committees and basically try and micromanage this giant, right? But if the word of the law is that we're never going to have grand jury systems, we're never going to prosecute unless we prove that it wasn't absolutely necessary, I think is the language, right? If we don't change that language and make it so a police officer who may have harmed or murdered a citizen is treated exactly as every other citizen, then we're really paddling upstream. If we don't start considering that the police officer is on equal footing with us, and I understand that, like, we want to pay homage and we want to respect our officers because they do have a difficult job. They do put their lives on line on a regular basis for all of us, right? We all want to be protected. That's really important. But if we're not going to, I want to be protected, right? I don't want to burn bridges with my police force. If somebody breaks into my house and tries to hurt me because I'm a Black Lives Right activist and there's death threats, right? I'd like to be protected too, because that's a reality. But if we don't approach those macro issues like state law or federal law, and we're still not going to be able to see the immediate changes that we need. We're talking another couple decades. We're talking another century of us dealing with this problem. Thousands of people dead every year. But we have to all agree that there's a problem. We have to start having that conversation and then act. Make sure that we're saying, these are the legislators that we need in office in order to make this bill happen, to make this law change. But I agree that, yes, we can do things to protect our communities, right? We can have closer networks with our police officers, our police departments, our civic leaders. We can pay closer attention to one another in our neighborhoods and our communities, and we can know each other and shake hands and care. But yes, ultimately we do have to change on the macro scale by state policy.
And I'm going to interrupt because I want to say that Kamau really walks the walk. So on August 11th at the Rochester Arts Center, Rochester for Justice will be having a community forum. And so if you go to Rochester for Justice, you can find out some information about that. That'll plug up really soon. And even better, on August 20th, they are hosting a community potluck, which I think is a great opportunity for police officers, for members of the community to come together. I believe Chief Peterson is going to make his world famous chicken wings. Although I've heard Kamau also has world famous chicken wings, so there may be some contest there. I just want to also recognize that we have other co-founders for Rochester for Justice. Heidi is here today, Heidi May Wilkins, and Abigail Davis. And if I don't know someone else who's in the room, I apologize. The last two questions.
But Nora, before you go to the next question, I think Chief Peterson didn't get a chance to respond
Thank you,
to a
Tina.
question that was
Thanks.
asked.
Yeah, back to that. This is, I think, the issue.
Can you just restate the question briefly?
Right, and I'm responding to the question, I'm going to paraphrase that, but when we train officers to the warrior ethic, if you will, doesn't that create policing that is likely to further this dynamic that we see? And this is our challenge. We talk about challenges for policing. When Pastor Barlow held a prayer meeting at his church, and a woman had stood up and said that she was afraid. She was afraid of her kids not coming home at night because of some interaction with police. And the reality is, if we train police officers to be afraid, to increase that level, hyper vigilant level, we're actually creating more fear. I mean, that's the result. Officers are going to be more fearful. The population we serve As a result, it's going to be more fearful. And when we have a system of use of force standards that are entirely based on fear, could we not expect that that's going to exponentially increase the problem instead of solve it? There's a balance to be had in teaching officers safety. There is certainly a balance to be had in making sure that they can do that in a way that is not increasing the population. But as we've talked about on numerous occasions, and what I'm trying to emphasize here is that there needs to be a change in that training, in that standard, in that perception, and in that culture. That many times, and if you look at these incidents across the country, as we've seen numerous video recordings of, in many cases, that fear, that immediate split second I have to do something here, can be alleviated by taking a step back instead of taking a step forward. And that's what is unfortunately not taught with the warrior ethic. It's not taught culturally in police departments. But when we talk about change, that's one of them that needs to take place. As you see in the rest of the world, when the decision or the judgment as to whether an incident is strictly unavoidable, well, that means that if you could have backed up, stood behind the tree, stood in the back of the car and stood in front of it, stood behind a tree, or flat run away, as we saw, yeah, that's actually the expectation. Not only the expectation, it's the requirement. And I think that in response to find that balance is we need to find the balance. This is how you protect yourself, but a critical element of protecting yourself is not getting in that situation to begin with, or realizing that you can back up. We've had, people on my staff are familiar with, we had a situation probably a decade ago now, where we were having people that were getting hurt, and there was use of force situations, in some cases deadly use of force situations, because officers were stopping vehicles and there were people that were trying to stop or escape or drive away, and they're reaching into cars to try to grab the keys and turn that car off. And what happened? Well, they're going to get hurt. There's going to be a use of force. That could be, in some cases, was a deadly force situation. The reason that officers were doing that was because they were pretty sure that was my expectation. That they were not going to let the bad guy get away. That was their responsibility. And they were willing to put their life literally on the line so that didn't happen. And I read these reports, and we went over these incidents like we talked about, and I'm in amazement. Really? Because I had never stood in front of officers and said, your job is to go home at the end of your shift, and the bad guy gets away, that's my job to explain why. And why nobody got hurt in that process. That was a cultural change for our part. Now, we haven't had an incident probably in the last decade like that. But we had a lot of, but that's the reality. That if we put officers and continually put officers out there with this expectation, you are to lay your life on the line and never back up, guess what they're going to do? They'll do it. They got the commitment, dedication, and courage to do it. And that's not what we want to see happen. We don't want officers to get hurt. We don't want citizens to get hurt. And a lot of times, it's not about being the warrior.
Can I say one thing too? And I think one of the biggest things is, I think, to escape that, right? I used to be a professional mover, right? And I can say flat out, I was a horrible individual while I was being a professional mover because it was a culture within that. Like, I did it for 14 years, lump furniture, real manly man work, right? And there was a lot of that type of language that I was around all the time, right? And my wife would agree that when I was not a good person during that period of time, that because of the culture that I was really surrounded by, working ridiculous hours, 70, 80 weeks. I think one of the things that when you hear a lot from a lot of Black Lives Matter activists, and a lot of people who are concerned about this issue, is that where are the good cops, right? Not the bad apple part, right? And I think that one of the things that helps break that down is actually opening up, I think. And I think the community, many communities are just waiting for police officers to open up and explain exactly what you just said, right? To say, no, the culture within our department actually looks like this, right? That honesty and the thin blue line, right, of protecting one another, that's one of the areas that unless it's actually exposed, unless somebody says, hey, these guys act like this all the time in the locker room, right? That unless people actually talk about that, meaning police officers, then really there's kind of this code, there's just protection. And if that's not exposed, then people get real comfortable with that too, right? And that's from just my perspective, that like it becomes something that the culture doesn't escape because nobody says, like you have, that's enough of that.
Cheryl, do you still have a question?
Well, in light of the time, I think I'll pass, but I was asked to thank the officers and the staff that have shown up tonight to come to the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
I do. So I appreciate the difference in the laws that you identified here and that plays a role in how we police in the United States. And then you had the caveat that you weren't going to talk about race. The creation and construction of the laws are actually part of our racial history. And that if we don't talk about race and how we've constructed the laws, we're not going to be able to change them. Because the history of plantation slavery in this country, and then its ending, right, in abolition, the criminal justice system stepped in to control the African American population in this country. So that those laws and how we ended up in this place is connected to racism. And if we don't start there, we're not going to be able to explain away individual police shootings or the disparities in the people that we have. We may not have it in terms of how many stops we have, but we do know in Rochester, Minnesota, that it starts in the schools, right? We have data now about school disparities and their discipline policies and how they get referred to the police and that the police are in the schools and what they do. It starts there. We do have data about disparities in the jails, right? Disparities in, we can go right now and look in the jails and I'm guessing there we could see it. So that it isn't just about individual attitudes and bad cops. It's about a whole national history about racism. And I appreciate that the laws are different, but we're going to have to explain why. Why did we get here? Why do we have laws that are willing to justify shooting? Who are we trying to control? Who are we controlling? Why is it okay to shoot a felon? And who gets labeled a felon? It's disproportionate. It's systemic. It's not just systemic that the legal system somehow we ended up here. We have a systemic racist legal system, and we have to address that.
If you felt that I was trying to avoid the subject of racism, let me correct that perception. My point was that we have a system that is predicated on a standard that's different in the world, that's producing a much different result. And I think I indicated race, bias, discrimination is not unique to the United States. Mm-hmm. Obviously, other countries have found a way to deal with this more effectively, particularly when we talk about this issue. The problem, as much as we would want to confront the issue, the underlying issues of race in this, is in many respects why you see so much inertia around this issue. Because as Kamau has indicated, we can't even get people to acknowledge that there is a racial issue or there's the racial bias, whether it's in the criminal justice system or the education system or the housing system, the health system, etc. And if we continually play that record of, no, it's not race that's causing it. Yeah, it is a racial. No, we're not racist. Yes, you are racist. And at the same time, we're killing 3 people every day while that argument's going on. That's what I find unacceptable. we need to find a way to say, you know what, it's a human rights issue. We need to fix that. And when we stop killing 3 people a day, we can absolutely have these discussions about how attitudes and perceptions and everything else is playing into that. But I'm not willing to have another, 3.5 decades of my career to prolong that argument at the cost of 3 lives a day.
So I really appreciate your saying that, and, you know, again, it's another really oh yeah, aha moment. But I think what the chief is saying too is that we can have sort of yes and, you know? Because if we approach change from we've got to get rid of racism and get rid of white privilege and do that first, then you know, we need, not that we shouldn't keep calling it out, recognizing it, you know, what the chief is suggesting wouldn't fix everything for sure. But and yet, can we start to move in that direction, and would it fix something? And you know, my gut reaction is that if we could move in that direction, it would be an enormous shift that would be not just helpful to stop killing black people, but to change a lot that goes on in our culture, just around, you know, what does it mean to be a police officer?
And I'm going to jump in. It's
Let
now
Kamau
8:45.
answer. Can Kamau address that?
And he will be in just a moment. I want to remind everybody that this discussion can continue at the awesome event that is being hosted by Rochester for Justice on August 11th, and then the community potluck on August 20th. And I'm going to let Kamau have the last few words, and then we're going to close.
So you're right? You're completely, utterly right. And the way that I look at it, especially in light of the OCR report, the way I look at it is how that plays down the road. We got kids that are being disciplined in a biased way, racist way, right? The language around it has been unintentional racial bias, right? As opposed to admitting that it's just flat out racism. 5 years the feds were in our schools, and they just found de facto evidence that it's actually occurring in not just one school, but every single school and all the high schools, right? And my concern is the idea that some of those kids are going to want to be cops. Some of those kids are going to want to stay home, right? And they're going to grow into police officers. But the idea of attacking all racism and figuring out, like, with some magical wand that I would be able to say the right thing to the majority of all white folks to make them realize, oh yeah, what have I been thinking of this whole time, you know? Like, my uncle was a racist, and my dad was a racist, and I had no idea, right? And they just wake up one day, get woke, right? But while we're dealing with that, and like Tina said, that while we're dealing with that, and we're still approaching and focusing in very closely on that issue, there's also these things that we can do to make sure that we stop dying, that all of us stop dying. Police officers stop getting shot, black people stop getting shot, me and you being 8 times more likely to die at the hands of a police officer, those kind of things, by changing policy, and by us bonding behind that, because there's all kinds of well-intentioned white folks that racist, unintentionally racist, or unconsciously racist, or not, that understand the issue, that understand the idea that we're seeing way too much death, and they know, and maybe even their argument is, well, white people get killed too, right? Great. So let's approach this issue. Let's approach this idea that if we change legislation, if we change the legalese of that language, right, and say, no, they have the duty to retreat, or some type of caveat that actually describes that, no, they don't just have the active right to pull out a gun and shoot, that they have to de-escalate and these kind of things, and that can be done. That part could be done with one fell swoop. We get everybody behind it, get the right legislators in, and now we have a way to prosecute when people do wrong. Right? We have a way to actually identify that and then act on it. Meanwhile, the other part of that puzzle, that's like a lot of work, and that's going to take, that's the part that's going to take the longest. But we can actually change the legal language, and then we have a lot more power.
I want to thank our start. Just a start. Share this information. Encourage people to come on August 11th. Yes.
Question, what can we do meantime, between time, until the next meeting?
Talk to your
As a-
legislators, talk to your people in the House, people in the Senate. When you go, this is election time. Say, this is important. We don't want that three citizens are getting killed a day. That's gotta stop.
And we've got 3 legislative candidates in the room here, so we could ask them what they want.